The moment Jane Collins stepped off the stagecoach in Caldwell, Kansas, in the spring of 1882, every man within 20 yards stopped what he was doing and stared, not with admiration, but with the kind of doubtful appraisal reserved for horses that looked too fine-boned for hard labor. She wore a traveling dress of deep blue wool, her hair pinned neatly beneath a hat that had cost more than most of these men earned in 2 weeks. Her luggage was real leather, her gloves were cream-colored, and she carried herself with the straight spine of a woman who had grown up in drawing rooms and attended a finishing school in Cincinnati. She was 24 years old, recently widowed, and had used every cent of her late husband's modest insurance policy to purchase a small plot of land 7 miles outside of Caldwell, because she had decided, in the stubborn and absolute way that grief sometimes makes a person decide things, that she was going to start over somewhere no one knew her name. She had not anticipated quite how loudly the town of Caldwell would announce its skepticism. The stagecoach driver, a weathered man named Holt who had been hauling passengers across the Kansas plains for 15 years, took one look at her trunks and shook his head slowly. He said nothing directly to her, but he said it loudly enough to the stable hand helping him unload that Jane heard every word. "City woman," Holt muttered. "Bought land out on the Ridgeway parcel, or so I hear. Give her a week before she comes crying back to the depot." The stable hand, a boy of perhaps 16, laughed under his breath. Jane set her jaw and reached for the largest of her trunks herself, which surprised both of them enough that they went quiet. She was dragging it toward the general store when she first heard his voice. "Leave that. You will throw your back out before you even get to your property." She turned, and there was Matthew Collier. He was leaning against the post of the hardware store across the dusty street, arms folded, watching her with an expression that was neither mocking nor particularly warm. He was somewhere in his early 30s, broad-shouldered, with dark hair that curled slightly at the temples where sweat had dried in the morning heat. His hat was pushed back on his head, and he had the kind of face that had been outdoors long enough to make its lines permanent. He wore a working man's clothes, worn but clean, and there was a quality about him that Jane would later struggle to name but would eventually settle on as steadiness, the way a good fence post does not move regardless of what the wind does. "I am managing perfectly fine," she said. "You are managing to scratch up good leather on a bad road," he said, already crossing toward her with an unhurried stride that somehow still covered the distance quickly. He picked up the trunk without straining and looked at her, waiting. "Matthew Collier," he said. "I work the Rafter City-Bred north edge of town. You are the woman who bought the Ridgeway parcel." It was not a question, but she answered it anyway. "Jane Collins. And yes, I am." Something moved across his face. It was not the doubt she had seen on Holt's face, not the amusement she had seen on the stable boy's. It was closer to consideration, the way a man looks at a problem he has not yet decided is unsolvable. "Where do you want these?" he asked. "I have arranged to hire a wagon from the livery to take them to the property. I was told to ask for a man named Abe Prout." "Abe Prout is in bed with a fever and has been for 3 days," Matthew said. "His son Danny will be there. He is 12 and cannot lift a trunk like this one. You will want help." "Do you always volunteer your help to strangers before they ask for it?" Jane said, not unkindly. He looked at her steadily. "Only when it is plain they need it." That was how it began. The town of Caldwell was, in 1882, a genuine cattle town, raw and loud and smelling of livestock and ambition in equal measure. It sat on the edge of the Kishom Trail's northern reach, and every spring and summer the cowboys came through driving longhorn cattle up from Texas, and the saloons and the hotels and the general stores all swelled with business, and the streets turned to churned mud from thousands of hooves. It was not a gentle place. It was not a place that had much patience for gentleness in any form. Jane's land was 7 miles out, as she had said, on the Ridgeway parcel, which had gotten its name from the family that had homesteaded it 15 years earlier, and then abandoned it 3 years later after a drought killed their crops and their will simultaneously. The house that remained was small but structurally sound. 2 rooms with a separate lean-to kitchen, a stone fireplace that needed rechinking, and a well that still produced good water. There were 6 acres cleared, and another 14 that were pasture, and a barn that was genuinely serviceable if you ignored the fact that the north wall had developed a lean. Jane stood in front of the house for a long time after the wagon dropped her things, after young Danny Prout had collected his coin and turned his horse back toward town. She stood there in the early afternoon light with the Kansas wind pulling at her hat and the grass going on in every direction with nothing to stop it, and she felt the full weight of what she had done settle over her like a blanket that was either going to warm her or suffocate her. She went inside and unpacked her things methodically, because that was how her mother had taught her to handle overwhelming situations. You move your hands and your mind will follow. Matthew Collier came back the next morning. He knocked on the door frame, hat in hand, and when she opened the door he told her that the fireplace would not draw properly until the chimney was cleared, and that if she tried to light it without clearing it first she would fill the house with smoke. He said it plainly, without judgment, and when she asked how she was supposed to clear a chimney he told her he had brought the tools and could show her. She let him show her. That was the beginning of an education she had not known she needed. Over the following 2 weeks, Matthew Collier appeared at the Ridgeway parcel with a frequency that she first found suspicious, and then found herself looking forward to, and she was uncomfortable with that second thing, so she kept her manner brisk and her questions practical. He showed her how the well rope needed to be replaced before it frayed all the way through and dropped the bucket. He showed her which boards in the lean-to kitchen floor were rotten and needed replacing, and which ones just looked alarming but were sound. He brought her a list of what she would need from the general store to get through a Kansas summer on her own, and the list was so thorough and specific that she spent an evening studying it like a text she intended to memorize. She noticed that he never talked down to her. He was direct, sometimes blunt, but there was nothing condescending in his manner. When she asked a question, he answered it as though the question was worth answering. When she made a mistake, like the afternoon she tried to repair the fence line on the western edge of the property and used the wrong gauge wire, he looked at it, told her it would not hold a determined cow, and then showed her how to do it correctly without making her feel foolish. The other men in town were not like that. She had gone to the general store in that first week, operated by a man named Gerald Foss who had a long face and a longer memory for every piece of gossip ever told in the county. He had served her politely enough, but she had heard him telling his wife in the back room, apparently not caring that the sound carried, that the Collins woman was going to be back on the eastbound stage before the summer was half done. She had heard the same sentiment expressed in variations at the post office, at the church on her first Sunday, and most pointedly at the small social gathering organized by the women of the town's Ladies' Aid Society, which met on the second Tuesday of each month and which Jane had attended, because she was determined to integrate herself into the community. The women had been polite in the careful, surface way of people who have already decided their opinion and do not intend to be moved from it. Mrs. Edna Cross, who was the wife of the largest landowner in the county, had looked at Jane's hands and said, with the sweetness that Midwestern women often used as a delivery mechanism for unkind observations, "You have such lovely soft hands, dear. I imagine they will roughen up quite a bit if you are really intending to stay." Jane had smiled and said, "I am counting on it." But she had felt the dismissal like a cold stone in her chest, and that night she had sat at the table in her small house with the lamp burning low, and she had allowed herself, for exactly 1 hour, to wonder if everyone was right. Then she had gone to bed, slept soundly, risen before dawn, and gone out to start rechinking the fireplace herself. It was during that work, on her knees with mortar on her hands and her hair escaping its pins, that Matthew arrived and found her at it. He stood in the doorway for a moment before she noticed him. When she looked up, there was something in his expression that she could not quite read, something that had shifted slightly from the careful neutrality he usually wore around her. "I thought you were coming to town today," he said. "I am, after I finish this section." She turned back to her work. He was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "You mixed the mortar correctly. I followed your instructions. Most people still get it wrong the first time." She felt something warm move through her at that, which she firmly attributed to the satisfaction of having done something correctly and absolutely nothing else. It was about 3 weeks into her time on the Ridgeway parcel that she heard, through the reliable channel of young Danny Prout, who had taken a liking to stopping by when he was supposed to be running errands, what Matthew Collier had said to a group of men at the livery stable. Apparently several of them had been discussing the city woman's land purchase, with the mixture of amusement and head-shaking that passed for informed analysis among men who gathered around livery stables. And someone had said directly to Matthew that he was wasting his time riding out there, because the woman would be gone before summer ended. Matthew had reportedly been quiet for a moment, and then he had said, "Give her 1 season, you will see." When Danny told her this, Jane felt something she could not immediately identify. She sat with it through the afternoon while she was staking out the kitchen garden she intended to plant, turning the words over in her mind the way you turn a coin to examine both sides. "Give her 1 season. You will see." She was not sure whether she was moved by the fact that he believed in her, or unsettled by the fact that he had needed to defend her, or bothered by the suggestion that belief in her capabilities could be expressed as a bet to be won or lost. She was probably all 3 of those things at once. She was also, if she was being entirely honest with herself in the way that solitary evenings on the Kansas plains tend to encourage, grateful in a way that went beyond gratitude for a practical ally. She did not let herself examine that too closely. Matthew Collier had been born in Missouri in 1850 and had come west at 16 with his father and 2 older brothers, following the particular current of restlessness and ambition that moved through men of that era like a river current, pulling them toward whatever horizon had not yet been reached. His father had died of fever the second winter. His oldest brother had gone north into Nebraska and built something solid there. His middle brother, Tom, had been killed in a cattle dispute in 1876, one of the quieter injustices of the frontier, where conflicts over land and water and trail rights were settled with the kind of finality that left no appeal. Matthew did not talk about Tom much, but Jane came to understand, as weeks passed and they spent more time together, that the loss had altered him in some fundamental way, had made him more careful with his words and more deliberate with his commitments, as though he understood better than most people the weight that promises carried. He had been working the rafter sea for 7 years, long enough to be considered a fixture of the operation. The rafter sea was owned by a man named Clement Hayes, who was in his 60s and had built the ranch from a stake claim in the late 1860s. He was gruff in the way that men who have spent decades being practical tend to be gruff, but he was not unkind, and he respected Matthew's work enough to give him considerable authority in the running of the spread. Matthew was not married. He had been engaged once, to a woman named Clara in the late 1870s, but she had gone back east after the first winter on the frontier and broken the engagement by letter. He did not offer this information voluntarily. Jane heard it, as she heard most things, from the network of information that small communities generate and cannot help broadcasting. She found herself thinking about it more than was appropriate. The Kansas spring was extraordinary. She had not expected that, or perhaps she had expected it abstractly, the way you expect something you have read about in books, without anticipating the physical reality of standing in the middle of 10,000 acres of blooming prairie, with the light coming at you from everywhere at once because the sky is so large and so blue and so absolutely relentless in its beauty. The grasses moved in the wind, and the light moved with them, and the whole world seemed to be breathing. She had grown up in Cincinnati, in a brick house on a narrow street, and she had married a quiet man named Robert Collins who worked in banking, and who she had loved in the gentle, undramatic way of two people who suit each other well, but do not set each other on fire. And Robert had died of a sudden heart failure at 31, and Jane had been 23 and left with a modest insurance payout and a hollow apartment that no longer felt like it belonged to her. She had needed something enormous. She had found the Kansas plains. The morning she got the kitchen garden planted was a morning in late April, and it was the first time in her memory that she had created something out of ground and seed with her own hands. And she stood there afterward with dirt under every fingernail and a soreness in her back, and shoulders that was entirely honest in the way that only physical labor can be honest, and she felt something that was close to joy. Matthew arrived that afternoon, as he had taken to doing every few days, sometimes with a practical purpose and sometimes, she was increasingly certain, without one. This time he brought a jar of her neighbor Elsa Brennan's apple preserves, which was so specific a gift that Jane suspected Elsa Brennan was either a very generous woman or was in the business of facilitating something she had decided should happen. She later discovered it was both. He stood in the doorway of the lean-to kitchen, looking at the garden she had pointed out through the window, and he was quiet for a long time. "You got the rows straight," he finally said. "I measured. Most people eyeball it and then wonder why their rows drift. I was a school teacher," she said. "Before I married, I had 23 students who depended on me measuring things accurately. The habit carries over." He looked at her then in a way that was different from his usual observation, which was always present but usually contained. This was something more open, and Jane felt it like warmth from an unexpected fire. "A school teacher," he said, "in Cincinnati, for 3 years before Robert and I married. You liked it." It was not a question. She wondered how he had heard that in what she said. "I loved it," she said simply. "Caldwell has a school," he said. "Single teacher, serves the town and the surrounding homesteads. Old Ben Garrett has been doing it, but he is 70 and his eyesight is failing. There has been talk of finding someone new for the fall term." Jane looked at him carefully. "Are you suggesting something?" "I am mentioning a fact," he said, with the ghost of something that might, if you were paying close attention, have been a smile. She applied to the school board the following week. The school board of Caldwell, Kansas, consisted of 3 men, Gerald Foss the storekeeper, Reverend Thomas Alcott, and Clement Hayes of the Rafter C. The irony of that last name was not lost on her. The meeting was polite and brief. Gerald Foss expressed concern, in his indirect way, about whether someone from the city would understand the needs of frontier children. Reverend Alcott asked about her faith, which was a question she answered honestly and which seemed to satisfy him. Clement Hayes looked at her for a long moment before he spoke. "Matthew Collier tells me you rechinked your own fireplace," Clement said. Jane blinked. "I did, and that you fixed your own fence line. After he showed me how." Clement nodded slowly, as though this confirmed something he had suspected. "Woman who can learn to do things she has never done before on her own land is a woman who can probably teach children to learn things they have never learned before. That is my assessment." Gerald Foss looked as though he had bitten something sour, but he did not argue with Clement Hayes, because no one argued with Clement Hayes. Jane Collins was offered the teaching position for the fall term, with a salary that would more than supplement what she could grow on her land. She went directly from the school board meeting to the Rafter C ranch, because she had learned by now where Matthew would be on a Tuesday afternoon, which was riding fence on the south pasture, and she rode out to find him because she wanted to tell him first. She had borrowed a horse from Elsa Brennan, a patient bay mare named Thistle, who had long since given up being impatient with inexperienced riders. Jane was not an accomplished horsewoman, but she was improving, because she was Jane Collins, and improvement was what she did with challenges. She found Matthew exactly where she expected him, working a section of fence near the creek line, and she pulled Thistle up and dismounted carefully, because there was a grace to dismounting that she had not yet fully mastered, and said, I got the teaching position." He turned, and the expression on his face was the most unguarded she had ever seen it. It was plainly and simply delight. Not the polite congratulatory expression of a social acquaintance, but something genuine and warm that moved across his face before he had time to arrange it into anything more controlled. "I knew they would take you," he said. "You told Clement Hayes about the fireplace." He did not look apologetic. "I told him what was true. You vouched for me." "I told him facts," he said again, but there was a warmth in it that made it something more than a simple correction. The facts told themselves. Jane stood in the spring afternoon with the creek running quietly behind the fence line and the cattle moving like slow amber shapes in the distance. And she looked at this man who had walked across a dusty street 3 weeks ago and picked up her trunk without being asked. And she thought, with a clarity that surprised her, that she was in a great deal of trouble. She said, "Thank you, Matthew," and she meant it in about 4 different ways at once. He said, "You earned it," and he meant it plainly, and she thought that might be the most romantic thing anyone had ever said to her, which told her something about the state she was in. The summer came in like a curtain being pulled back, revealing the full intensity of what the Kansas plains could do when they decided to be beautiful and punishing in the same breath. The heat was extraordinary. The sky was a particular blue that Jane could not have named before but now thought of as Kansas blue, vast and clean, and pressing down on the horizon like a weight. The cattle drives came through, filling the streets of Caldwell with noise and dust and the particular energy of men who had been on the trail for months and were ready to be paid and fed and rested. Jane's garden grew. She had planted beans, squash, tomatoes, onions, and a row of sunflowers along the fence line that she told herself were practical windbreaks and privately admitted were because she found them beautiful. The beans came in first, and she spent a long, sweaty afternoon picking and putting them up in jars she had ordered from the general store, and she felt an enormous satisfaction when she lined the jars up on the shelf in the lean-to kitchen and counted them. She was also, that summer, learning to ride properly. This was a project that Matthew had taken on with what she recognized as his characteristic approach to problems: patient, methodical, honest about what was wrong and what needed to be different, never unkind. He had persuaded Elsa Brennan to let Jane have Thistle on loan through the summer, and he spent part of 2 Saturday afternoons working with her in the open pasture behind her barn, teaching her how to sit a horse correctly, how to communicate through her weight and her knees rather than just the reins, how to read the animal's mood and respond to it rather than fighting it. She was a quick student. She had always been a quick student. On the 3rd Saturday, when she had cantered Thistle in a clean circle around the pasture without the stiffness that had been there before, she looked over at Matthew, who was leaning on the fence rail watching, and the expression on his face was the one she was learning to look for, that open, unguarded warmth, and she laughed at her own pleasure in seeing it. "You are not even going to say it," she called to him. "Say what?" he called back. "That I did it correctly." "You already know you did," he said. "I do not think you need me to say it." She brought Thistle around to the fence and looked down at him. "No," she agreed, "but I like it when you do." Something shifted in the air between them. She felt it distinctly, the way you feel a change in weather before the clouds actually appear. His expression did something complicated, and then he looked away toward the tree line to the north, and the moment passed, but it had been real, and they both knew it. She rode home that afternoon with the Kansas wind in her face and her heart doing something inconvenient in her chest. The complication arrived in July in the form of a woman named Helena Marsh, who came through Caldwell with her father and brother, who were land agents from Wichita looking to purchase some of the larger parcels in the county. Helena was 26, dark-haired, and startlingly pretty in a way that made everyone in the room aware of it. She was also, it became apparent at the social gathering Reverend Alcott hosted in honor of the Marsh family's visit, quite interested in Matthew Collier. Jane was at the gathering. She watched Helena Marsh attach herself to Matthew's conversation with the confidence of a woman who had never been told she was not welcome, and she watched Matthew respond with the polite courtesy that he showed everyone. And she sat with a cup of punch that she did not drink and felt something unpleasant moving through her that she would rather have called anything other than jealousy. Elsa Brennan sat down beside her. Elsa was 45, German-born, with a directness that Jane had come to appreciate enormously because it required no interpretation. "That woman is very beautiful," Elsa said pleasantly. "She is," Jane agreed. "Matthew looks as though he would rather be checking fence," Elsa observed. Jane looked more carefully. Elsa was not wrong. Matthew had the particular stillness of a man enduring a social situation rather than enjoying it, his responses polite but brief, his eyes moving to other parts of the room at intervals that suggested he was looking for an exit or a rescue. His eyes found Jane's across the room. She felt it like a small electric charge, the kind that sometimes built up on dry days and discharged when you touched a metal latch. He said something brief to Helena Marsh, nodded to her brother, and walked across the room. He sat down in the empty chair on Jane's other side, because Elsa had taken the chair to her left, and said quietly, "How is Thistle doing with the creek crossing? You said last week she was still hesitating." It was the most ordinary question he could have asked, and it was directed entirely at Jane, and it was the most pointed communication she had ever received in her life, without a word being said that was actually pointed. "She is getting better," Jane said, and her voice was entirely steady, because she was 24 years old and she was a woman who had built a fence line and rechinked a chimney and gotten herself a teaching position in a town that had dismissed her, and she was not going to let her voice tremble over a chair and a question about a horse. "Another week and I think she will take it without hesitation." "Good," he said. Elsa, beside her, said nothing at all, but Jane could feel her smiling. Helena Marsh departed Caldwell with her father and brother 3 days later, having not purchased any land, and the town returned to its ordinary summer rhythms. The week after Helena Marsh left, Matthew came by the Ridgeway parcel on a Thursday evening when he had no particular practical reason to be there. Jane was sitting on the front step watching the sunset, which was the kind of Kansas sunset that made you believe briefly in divine intervention, all orange and rose and deep purple, stacked above the flat horizon like a painting that could not decide when to stop. He dismounted and came and sat on the step beside her without asking if it was all right, but it was not an assumption, it was comfort, the ease of two people who have been around each other enough that the ordinary formalities have become unnecessary. They sat quietly for a while, watching the colors change. He said, "Can I ask you something?" "You can ask me anything," she said, and meant it. "Why here? Why Kansas? You had a life back east. You had people who knew you. You came out here alone to a piece of land you had never seen in a town that did not exactly welcome you." He paused. "Why?" She thought about it for a moment, not because she did not know the answer, but because she wanted to give him the true one. "When Robert died," she said, "the apartment we had shared felt like a museum of a life I was not going to have any more. And the people around me were kind, but their kindness was the kind that expects you to grieve in the right amount of time and then step back into something recognizable. There was a version of me that could have done that, could have gone back to teaching, or remarried someone steady and suitable and lived something quiet and managed and entirely fine." She paused. "I did not want entirely fine anymore. I wanted something that was actually mine, something I built." She gestured at the land around them, at the garden, at the barn with its leaning north wall that she had now stabilized, at the fields that were her responsibility and her challenge and her daily education. "This is mine. I built this. Every hard thing I have learned since I came here has gone into me, and I cannot give it back, and no one can take it, and that is what I needed." He was quiet for a long time after that. Then he said, "The first winter I was here after my father died, I thought about going home to Missouri every day for 3 months. Every single day I thought about it." He was looking at the horizon, not at her. "Then one morning I did not think about it, And I realized I did not know exactly when Kansas had become the thing I was thinking of as home instead of the thing I was thinking about leaving. She understood what he was telling her. It was not a simple thing, and he was not saying it simply, but she understood it. How long did it take, she asked, before it became home? He finally looked at her, and in the last of the sunset light his eyes were very warm. About 1 season, he said quietly. She felt that land somewhere inside her with a weight that was not unpleasant. She said, "Is that what you were betting on for me?" "I was not betting," he said. "I was certain." The silence after that was full of something that both of them chose to let sit there rather than disturb it, and she thought that was its own kind of answer. She did not sleep well that night, but it was not the unhappy kind of wakefulness. It was the wakefulness of someone whose heart is engaged and whose mind is trying to keep pace. August came and the heat intensified, and the summer grew long and full. Jane's garden produced more than she could eat alone, and she found herself driving into town with baskets of tomatoes and beans and squash, and leaving them at the church for distribution to families who needed them, which was a thing that Reverend Alcott noted warmly in his next Sunday sermon without naming her, which was both thoughtful and entirely unnecessary because every woman in the congregation knew whose garden that was. Edna Cross, the wife of the large landowner, approached Jane after church one Sunday in mid-August with an expression that was noticeably different from the one she had worn at the Ladies' Aid Society meeting in April. "I hear the school board has given you the fall position," Edna said. "They have," Jane said pleasantly. "Ben Garrett says you stopped by to go over his lesson plans and asked very sensible questions. Ben Garrett has been teaching those children for 12 years. He knows more about their learning needs than any written curriculum." Edna studied her with a direct gaze that Jane was now comfortable returning. "You have surprised some people," Edna said finally, and it was, by the standards of this woman, a significant concession. "I surprised myself some days," Jane said honestly, and that made Edna Cross do something that Jane suspected she did rarely. She laughed. A genuine, unreserved laugh that changed her face entirely and made her look considerably more likable. "Come to the Ladies' Aid Society next Tuesday," Edna said. "I believe you will find it more congenial than the first time." She was right about that. Jane had been on the Ridgway parcel for 5 months when the incident with the Hennessy boys occurred. There were 3 Hennessy brothers who worked as trail hands and had a reputation for getting into trouble when they were between drives and board. They had caused minor disturbances in town all summer without anything that rose to the level of genuine incident, and Caldwell's marshal, a lean man named Floyd Davis, who had seen enough real trouble to be unimpressed by the performative kind, had managed them adequately. What happened in September was that 2 of the Hennessy brothers, the younger 2, decided that it would be amusing to ride out to the Ridgway parcel and harass the city woman. They had clearly heard enough dismissive commentary about Jane to feel entitled to join in from a position of drunken boredom, and they came riding up her lane in the late afternoon shouting things that were offensive without being particularly imaginative. Jane was behind the barn when she heard them. She stood very still for a moment, assessing. 2 men on horseback, clearly drunk, shouting. The nearest neighbor was Elsa Brennan 1.5 miles away. She was alone. She was also not afraid, which she recognized as possibly a failure of imagination, but also possibly a useful quality. She walked around to the front of the barn with the shovel she had been using to clean out a stall, held it in both hands in a way that made absolutely clear it was available if needed, and looked at the 2 men on horseback with an expression that she had perfected over 3 years of managing a classroom of 23 children who were always testing limits. "Get off my property," she said. Her voice was calm and completely flat, which was more unnerving, she had found, than anger. The older of the 2 brothers, whose name was Cal, laughed. "Look at the city woman with her shovel," he called to his brother. "Get off my property," Jane said again, exactly the same way, and took 3 steps toward them. It was the 3 steps that did it. The horses shifted nervously, both of them, because horses are honest about threats in a way that men sometimes are not. And Cal Hennessy, who was drunk but not entirely stupid, looked at this woman walking toward him with a shovel, and something in his expression recalculated. Then there was the sound of another horse coming up the lane at a considerably faster pace than the Hennessy boys had arrived, and Matthew Collier pulled up in a cloud of dust and took in the scene in one quick assessment. Cal Hennessy looked between Matthew and Jane and made the calculation that people generally make when they realize a situation has moved outside their comfort zone. "Just having some fun," Cal said. "On someone else's land," Matthew said. His voice was very quiet. "Without an invitation." "No harm done," Cal said, already turning his horse. "Ride to Marshal Davis and tell him where you have been," Matthew said. "He will want to know." It was phrased as a suggestion, but it was not a suggestion, and Cal Hennessy understood that, and he and his brother left at a pace that expressed their understanding clearly. Jane lowered the shovel. "How did you know?" she asked. "Danny Prout saw them ride out this direction," Matthew said. "He came to find me." He dismounted and stood looking at her with an attention that was no longer contained. "Are you all right?" "I am perfectly all right," she said. "I had the shovel." "I know you did," he said, and there was something in his voice that was not entirely steady. "I know you did, but I rode fast anyway." She looked at him, at this man who had ridden fast anyway, and she thought that this might be the moment where she stopped pretending to herself about how she felt. "Matthew," she said. "Jane." He said her name the way he always said it, just her name, no qualifier, no title, just the name itself, which somehow when he said it sounded different from when anyone else did. "I think you should know," she said carefully, "that I am not particularly easy to be around. I have strong opinions, and I do not change them without evidence, and I am building something here that is mine, and I am not willing to give that up for anyone, and I have been in one good marriage already, and the grief of losing it was substantial, which means I am not interested in casual arrangements of any kind." He listened to all of this with his full attention. Then he said, "I know all of that already." She blinked. "You know all of that?" "I have been paying attention since April," he said. "Jane, I know who you are. I have been watching you build something extraordinary here for 5 months. I know you are not easy, and I know what you are building, and I know you are not interested in casual." He paused. "Neither am I. I have not been interested in casual since I was 20 years old, and I have been waiting a long time for someone who made the alternative seem worth the risk." She stood in the September afternoon with the shovel still in her hand, and the horses moving restlessly behind them, and the Kansas sky enormous overhead, and she looked at Matthew Collier and said, with an honesty that felt like stepping off a perfectly safe bank into perfectly clear water, "I am very glad you rode fast anyway." He crossed the space between them in 2 steps, and he took the shovel out of her hands and set it against the fence, and then he looked at her in that open, unguarded way she had been collecting all summer, and he said, "May I?" very quietly, and she said, "Yes," and he kissed her. It was a gentle, deliberate, completely certain kiss, the kind that does not require any adjustment or revision, the kind that feels like something that has been true for a while and has finally been said aloud. When it ended, she stood with her eyes closed for a moment longer, and when she opened them, he was watching her with an expression of such undefended warmth that she felt her chest ache with it. "I have been thinking about that since about the 2nd week of April," she said. "June for me," he said. "Only June? I thought earlier." "I knew earlier," he said with that ghost of a smile. "Thinking about it and admitting I was thinking about it are different things." She laughed, and it was the kind of laugh that comes from genuine happiness, the kind that surprises you with its own fullness. The fall term began on the first Monday of September, and Jane Collins walked into the Caldwell schoolhouse to find 31 children between the ages of 6 and 14, sitting in rows looking at her, with the collective assessment of children who have not yet decided whether a new teacher is friend or challenge. She had been in exactly this situation before, in Cincinnati, and she knew precisely what to do. She introduced herself. She asked each child to tell her one thing they were good at and one thing they wanted to learn. She listened to every answer with the same attention. By noon break, she had 31 children who were willing to give her a chance. And by the end of the first week, she had 31 children who were telling their parents that the new teacher was different. The parents came to her at the church on Sunday, one by one or in pairs, with the kind of careful and direct evaluation that frontier communities gave to anyone who was responsible for something they valued. She answered their questions honestly, asked her own questions about what their children needed and what difficulties they had had with learning, and took careful notes in a small leather notebook that she carried in her coat pocket. By October, she was not the city woman anymore. She was Miss Collins or Mrs. Collins, depending on who was talking, and she was the school teacher. And that was its own kind of identity in a place like Caldwell, solid and recognized, and woven into the fabric of how the town understood itself. She and Matthew had arrived at something that was not quite courting in the formal sense, and not quite anything else. It was the kind of developing thing that two people build when they are both too serious to rush, and too honest to pretend it is less than it is. He came to the Ridgeway parcel on weekends, and they worked on the land together, and they ate supper together, and they talked for long hours in the evenings about everything from the proper way to store root vegetables for winter to the political situation, following the Garfield assassination that autumn, which had shocked the country. They agreed on some things and argued about others with the productive interest of two people who respect each other enough to disagree openly. He told her about Tom. He did not tell it all at once. It came in pieces over several evenings, the way difficult things sometimes can be approached only in sections, but he told her the whole of it, and she listened without trying to fix it or minimize it, because some losses are not meant to be made smaller, only witnessed. She told him about Robert, about the quiet good love they had had, and the grief that had followed, and the way she had needed to take the grief and do something with it rather than let it settle over her like a permanent weather condition. Matthew listened to all of it with the same quality of attention he gave to everything, full and respectful, and without filling the silences before they were ready. October in Kansas was a revelation. The heat broke and the light changed to something golden and slanted, and the prairie grasses went to amber and rust, and the sunflowers along Jane's fence line, which had been standing tall all summer, dried to a beautiful rough architecture that she left standing through the fall because she liked the shapes they made against the sky. She harvested everything that could be harvested and put up more jars than she had shelf space for, and she traded some of it to Elsa Brennan for labor in recovering the Lenta kitchen roof before winter, and traded more to Gerald Foss for goods at the general store, and kept enough to see herself comfortably through the cold months. Gerald Foss, who had predicted she would be gone before summer ended, handed her change over the counter in October with an expression that had some genuine respect in it, which was not a small thing for Gerald Foss. "Good season," he said, looking at the jars she was trading. "Very good season," she agreed. He looked at her for a moment. "You intend to stay on?" "Through the winter and beyond," she confirmed. He nodded slowly. "I might have underestimated you," he said. It cost him something to say that. She could see it cost him something which made her value it more. "Most people did," she said without anger. "I was not certain myself that first week." He almost smiled. "Well," he said. "Well," she agreed and took her goods and went home. November came and the sky lowered and the first cold moved in off the plains with a seriousness that was different from the city cold she had known, which was a cold softened by buildings and streets and the aggregate warmth of thousands of people in close proximity. This was open ground cold, with nothing between it and you, and it was honest about what it was. She had prepared. She had laid in enough wood. She had the chimney properly working. She had her root cellar stocked and her pantry shelved and her animals, because she had acquired 2 goats and a small flock of chickens over the summer, properly sheltered. The first real snowstorm came in mid-November, and she woke up to white in every direction and a silence that was so complete it pressed on the ears, and she stood at the window for a full minute looking at it before she lit the stove and started breakfast. Matthew rode out through the snow that afternoon, which was exactly what she expected him to do, and she had coffee ready. He came in stamping snow off his boots and looked around the house, which was warm and tidy and properly provisioned, and he looked at her, who was warm and tidy and utterly unrattled. "You are completely fine," he said, with that note of open warmth. "I am completely fine," she confirmed. He sat down at her table and accepted the coffee and said, "I want to talk to you about something." Her heart did something complicated, because she was a woman who had become very good at reading Matthew Collier, and she knew when he was about to say something that mattered. "All right," she said, and sat down across from him. He turned the coffee mug in his hands, and for a moment he looked the way she imagined he might have looked at 19 or 20, before the frontier had settled into him and given him his permanent steadiness. "I have been working the rafter sea for 7 years," he said. "Clement Hayes has been talking for 2 years about who would take on the property when he is ready to step back. He is 63. He does not have children. He has talked to me about a partnership, working toward me taking on more ownership over time." He paused. "I have been careful about committing to that fully because I was not sure what my full future looked like, what I wanted it to look like." He looked up at her. "I am sure now." Jane held very still. "I am not asking you to change anything about what you have built," he said, and it was very important to him to say this. She could hear it in his voice. "Your land is yours. Your teaching position is yours. Everything you have built here is yours, and I am not suggesting that changes in any way." He paused again. "I am asking if you would be willing to build something with me as well, alongside what you have already built." She looked at this man across her kitchen table in the blue-white light of the snowstorm, and she thought about April and the trunk in the dusty street, and a season of sunflowers and fence lines and riding lessons and a kiss beside the barn. And she thought about all the evenings of conversation, and all the mornings she had woken up on this land that was hers and felt, underneath the rightful pride of that, a quality of longing that she now understood clearly. "Are you asking me to marry you?" she said. "I am asking very badly," he said, with an honesty that made her love him, "because I have never done this before and I am finding it harder than any practical problem I have ever solved." "Yes," she said. He looked up sharply. "Yes," she said again. "Matthew, yes." He stood up so quickly the chair scraped, and she stood too, and he came around the table and took both her hands in his, and he looked at her with that fully open expression that she had been collecting all year and that now she understood was entirely hers. "I was not expecting yes that quickly," he said, a little breathlessly. "I have been thinking about it since June," she said. "I was only waiting for you to catch up." He laughed, the full genuine laugh she had heard rarely and treasured each time, and he kissed her again, and outside the snow kept falling, white and silent and absolute over the Kansas plains. They were married in the Caldwell church in December of 1882, on a day when the cold was sharp, and the sky was that specific winter blue that seems to go on past sight. And the whole town came, because by December Jane Collins was not the city woman who had gotten off the stagecoach looking too fine-boned for frontier life. She was the school teacher. She was the woman who had rechinked her own chimney and fixed her own fence line and put up enough preserves to fill a shelf, and learned to ride and built herself a life from a piece of land and a stubbornness that the people of Caldwell had come to recognize as a genuine and admirable quality. She was Matthew Collier's woman, and he was her man, and those were both truths that had been established slowly and thoroughly over a season and had no brittleness in them. Reverend Alcott performed the ceremony with genuine warmth. Elsa Brennan, who had been quietly engineering this outcome since about May, cried and looked satisfied about it simultaneously. Clement Hayes sat in the front pew, because he had considered himself invested in this outcome since the school board meeting, and he shook Matthew's hand afterward with a grip that said everything his few words expressed. Gerald Foss brought them a gift that he had clearly put thought into, a quality almanac for the 1883 growing season, which was so entirely him and so genuinely useful that Jane thanked him warmly and meant it. Edna Cross hugged Jane after the ceremony, which was a thing Jane suspected Edna Cross had done to fewer than 10 people in her adult life, and said quietly, "I told Gerald Foss in April that he was wrong about you. He did not listen to me then. He has listened to more of what I say since." She said it with a dry satisfaction that Jane found completely appropriate. They spent their first night in Jane's house on the Ridgway parcel, because it was hers and she loved it, and Matthew understood that and had never suggested otherwise. He had, however, spent the 2 months of their engagement shoring up the leaning north wall of the barn until it was perfectly plumb, and she had come out one afternoon to find it done and looked at him and said, "Did you do that because it needed doing or because it was for me?" And he had said, "Both," and she had kissed him in the middle of the barn doorway for a considerable amount of time. The winter settled around them, and they settled into it together. It was a good winter, cold in the way that only the open plains can be cold, with ice that formed in perfect crystalline patterns on the window glass in the mornings and wind that found every imperfect seal in a house's construction. But they were warm and provisioned, and they had each other in the full daily reality of that, which is different from having someone at a distance, richer and more complicated and more deeply satisfying. She kept the Ridgway parcel, and she kept teaching. He worked the Rafter Sea and began the formal partnership with Clement Hayes that would gradually, over years, transfer more ownership to Matthew. They rode out to the Rafter Sea together on weekday mornings, Jane continuing to the schoolhouse in town, Matthew to the ranch, and came home together in the evenings to the Ridgway parcel, which they now both thought of as home. They had debates about what to call it. The Ridgway name no longer fit, because the Ridgways had been gone for 12 years, and the property belonged entirely to something new now. They went back and forth on it over supper one evening in January, and it was Matthew who finally said, "Collier's place sounds like my name is the only one on it, and Collins' place sounds like yours is," and Jane said, "Then it is the Collins-Collier property," and Matthew considered that and said, "That is a great deal of name for a 2-room house," and they both laughed. They settled on calling it the homestead, which was honest and plain and belonged to neither one of them specifically, which was exactly right. Spring returned with the swiftness that always surprised her, regardless of how many seasons she experienced it. Winter seemed long and absolute, and then one morning there was something different in the light, and the ground began to give, and the prairie went from tan to green with a speed that felt like a decision. She planted her second kitchen garden with the confidence of someone who had done it before and learned from the first time, expanding it considerably, adding a plot for medicinal herbs that old Ben Garrett's wife had suggested and provided starts for. She was, by her second spring, a fully recognized member of the Caldwell community. Her students had come back for the spring term with eagerness that was the best professional satisfaction she had ever known. She had several children who had made significant progress over the winter with reading and arithmetic, and their parents had noticed. And word of that traveled the way everything traveled in a small community, thoroughly and quickly. There was a boy named Eli Hart who had come to her in September, unable to read a word at 14 years old enough to be embarrassed by it, and young enough to still want help if it was offered without humiliation. She had worked with him separately, morning breaks and lunch hours, without making it visible to the other students, and by December he could read a simple text haltingly, and by March he was reading with growing fluency, and the look on his face the first time he read a full page aloud without stopping was something Jane kept with her the way you keep certain things, carefully and permanently. She came home and told Matthew about it, and he sat at the table and listened to the whole of it, and when she finished he said quietly, "You are remarkable, Jane," with the directness that she had loved in him from the beginning, the directness that did not dress things up or soften them into something managed, just said the true thing. She went around the table and kissed him on top of his dark head, and he reached up and caught her hand and held it without letting go for a long time. Clement Hayes died in May of 1883, which was a loss that moved through the community as the loss of a strong established thing does, leaving a genuine absence. He had not died unexpectedly. He had been unwell through the winter, and he had spent those months with Matthew completing the paperwork and arrangements that transferred a significant portion of the Rafter Sea to Matthew's ownership, which was clearly what Clement had intended, and which gave Matthew something to carry forward in his grief. Jane had attended Clement Hayes in his last weeks when she could, reading to him in the evenings and bringing food from her kitchen, because it was what she did when someone needed practical care, and she had the ability to provide it. Clement had looked at her near the end, in one of his clearer moments, and said, "Matthew was right about you from the start." He usually is, but this was his best assessment. Then he had gone to sleep. She told Matthew what Clement had said, and he was quiet for a while, and then he said, "He was the closest thing to a father I had out here after my own died. He was a hard man in the way that country makes men hard, but he was honest and he was fair, and that is worth more than most things." She held his hand through that evening, and he let her, and that was its own kind of love, the kind that does not need performance. By the fall of 1883, Matthew was running the Rafter Sea effectively as his own operation, with the hands that had worked under Clement remaining loyal to him, because loyalty on the frontier followed competence and fairness, and Matthew had always demonstrated both. Jane was entering her second year as the Caldwell schoolteacher, and her reputation had expanded sufficiently that two families had moved their children from neighboring homesteads specifically to have her teach them. They were settled in their life in a way that felt like the solidity of a well-built thing, which is not the same as stasis. It has its own vitality, its own daily interest, but it has a foundation. In late October of 1883, Jane told Matthew she was expecting. She told him in the kitchen of their homestead in the early morning before he had ridden out, while they were drinking coffee at the table with the lamp still lit because the fall mornings came dark now. She said it plainly because it was their way with each other. He put down his coffee. He looked at her for a moment, and the expression on his face moved through several things, and she watched all of them, and the one it settled on was the same open, unguarded warmth that she had been collecting since April of 1882, but larger now, expanded to contain something new. "A baby," he said. "A baby," she confirmed. "Spring, I think. I am going to talk to Dr. Whitmore this week." He stood up and came around the table and took her face in both his hands with a care that she felt through her whole body, and he said, "Jane," just her name, just that, and kissed her with a gentleness that made her eyes sting. She kept teaching through November and into December because she was Jane Collins Collier, and she did not stop doing things because they became more complicated. She adjusted and continued. By December, she had arranged for Ben Garrett's daughter-in-law, who had herself been a teacher back in Indiana and had moved to Caldwell with her husband the previous year, to take over the spring term, with Jane agreeing to return in the fall. She spent the winter with a fullness that she had not anticipated, not the winter of the previous year when she had been newly married and still learning what daily life with another person felt like, but a deeper fullness, the specific weight of carrying a future. Matthew was careful with her, without being foolish about it. He took on more of the homestead work without remarking on it, not reducing her autonomy but supplementing it, which was the difference between treating someone as capable and treating someone as fragile. She noticed the distinction and loved him for it. Elsa Brennan came over twice a week through the winter, bringing knowledge about pregnancy and childbirth, and child-rearing from having had 4 children of her own, which she shared with Jane in the direct, no-nonsense manner that was her way, without alarming her but without softening the practical realities. Jane was grateful for the honesty. The baby came in April of 1884, on a morning when the spring was just beginning to show itself in the same tender, green-going way it had the year Jane arrived. And it was a boy, healthy and loud, and expressing his opinions on the matter of existing from the first moment. Matthew was in the room for the birth, which was not entirely customary but which Jane had asked for, and which Dr. Whitmore had accommodated with the pragmatism of a frontier doctor who understood that frontier people made their own arrangements. Matthew held her hand through the long hours and did not flinch once, and when the baby arrived and the room was suddenly full of a different kind of sound, she looked at Matthew and found him undone in the way she had never seen him undone, completely without his usual contained steadiness, just wide open and overwhelmed and absolutely present. "A boy," she said, tired and enormous with relief. "A boy," he said, and his voice was not fully steady at all. They named him Thomas, for Matthew's brother who had been lost too young, which felt right in the way that honoring the past while building the future is always right. Thomas Collier was a loud, enthusiastic, and entirely vigorous child from his first week, which his mother took as an encouraging indicator, and his father took as a fair warning about the future. He grew with the speed that frontier children seem to grow, fed on clean air and good food, and the particular vitality of people who are building something. Jane went back to teaching in the fall of 1884 with Thomas in a cradle in the corner of the schoolhouse, which the school board had initially considered unusual, and then decided was workable, partly because Jane presented it as a practical solution, and partly because Matthew had spoken to Clement Hayes's old associate on the board, and pointed out that losing the best teacher Caldwell had ever had over a question of childcare logistics would be a poor trade. The children loved Thomas. Eli Hart, who was now 15 and reading with genuine fluency, was particularly devoted to the baby, and Jane would sometimes find him during lunch break sitting with the cradle, talking to Thomas seriously about whatever he had recently read, as though the baby had the same capability for learning that he had been discovering in himself over the past year. 1885 came in mild, and the Rafter Sea had a good spring, with the cattle drive still moving up from Texas, though the days of the open range were already beginning to show their ending on the horizon. Barbed wire had changed the nature of the plains, drawing boundaries where there had been open space, and Matthew watched this change with the thoughtfulness he brought to everything, seeing it clearly and adapting rather than resisting. He bought more land adjacent to the Rafter Sea, negotiating carefully, and he and Jane talked through every major decision at their kitchen table in the evenings, because their partnership was real in every sense. She had opinions about the land and the cattle operation that were formed from genuine understanding, acquired over 3 years of living on the Kansas plains and paying attention, and he respected those opinions not because she was his wife, but because they were well-reasoned, which was its own form of deep respect. In the late summer of 1885, 3 years after Jane had stepped off the stagecoach in Caldwell with her leather trunks and her cream-colored gloves, she was walking through the town with Thomas on her hip and a basket on her other arm, and she passed the stage depot, and a new coach had just arrived, and a young woman was stepping down from it, looking around Caldwell with the expression of someone who has made a significant decision and is now confronting what it means. She was perhaps 20, with a round face and good clothes that said city rather than country, and she was holding a letter in her hand that she was consulting anxiously, and the depot man was saying something to his assistant about how long these Eastern girls lasted. Jane stopped. She shifted Thomas to a more comfortable position and walked over to the young woman. "Excuse me," she said. "Are you just arriving?" The young woman looked at her with the cautious relief of someone who had feared the whole town would be as dismissive as the man at the depot. "I am. I have purchased a piece of land east of town. I do not know quite where to start." Jane looked at this woman for a moment, at the anxiety in her face and the resolve beneath it that was the same resolve she had seen in her own mirror 3 years ago. "I know exactly where you start," Jane said. "Come with me. I will introduce you to Elsa Brennan, who knows more about getting established on the Kansas plains than anyone I have ever met. And then I will show you where the general store is, and the church, and the school, and I will tell you what you actually need to know rather than what people assume you need to know. How does that sound?" The young woman's anxiety shifted to something that was the beginning of relief. "That sounds like more than I expected," she said honestly. "It is exactly what I needed when I arrived," Jane said, "and someone gave it to me and now I am giving it to you. That is how it works out here, or how it should work." She shifted Thomas again, who had grabbed a fistful of her collar and was examining it with absolute concentration, and she looked at the young woman. "My name is Jane Collins Collier," she said. "I have been here 3 years. I own a homestead 7 miles out, I teach school, and I have learned more about this land in 3 years than I thought possible. You will too. What is your name?" The young woman straightened slightly and Jane recognized the movement, someone deciding to meet the challenge head-on. "Margaret Hale," she said. "Welcome to Caldwell, Margaret," Jane said. "Come on, let us get your things sorted." That evening, after Margaret Hale had been installed at the boarding house and provided with a thorough practical orientation, and introduced to Elsa Brennan, who had taken one look at her and immediately begun the same systematic education she had given Jane, Jane came home to the homestead. Matthew was in the barn finishing up the evening feed when she arrived, and she came in and leaned against the stall, with Thomas on her hip still gamely awake despite the hour, and she told Matthew about Margaret Hale. He listened, and when she finished he looked at her with that expression she had never stopped collecting, that particular warmth. "Of course you did," he said simply. "Someone did it for me," she said. "A few someones," he agreed. He came over and took Thomas, who immediately grabbed Matthew's ear instead of his collar, apparently a satisfactory trade. How did she seem? Anxious, capable, stubborn in the way that is useful rather than the way that is just stubbornness. Jane smiled. "She reminded me of someone." "I wonder who," Matthew said dryly. She took his free hand, the one Thomas was not currently occupied with, and they walked out of the barn together into the evening. The homestead looked exactly as it had looked in that first spring afternoon when she had stood in front of it alone, and felt the full weight of what she had undertaken, small and sturdy, and surrounded by the enormous Kansas sky. But now there was a kitchen garden that she knew how to maintain, and a fence line that she had learned to repair, and a barn with a perfectly plumb north wall, and sunflowers along the fence that were dried to their fall architecture, and a man beside her whose hand was warm and certain in hers, and a boy on that man's hip who was the evidence of all of this, the accumulated, tangible evidence that she had come to this wild and difficult and extraordinary place, and she had built something that was entirely hers and entirely theirs at the same time. The stars were beginning to appear, the way they appeared on the Kansas plains differently than anywhere else she had ever been, not emerging one or two at a time but in a rush all at once, as though the night had been waiting and then decided it was time. "Matthew," she said. He said, looking up at the same sky. "What did you see? In April of 1882, when I stepped off that stagecoach." She had wondered this for 3 years in various forms, and she wanted to know the full answer. He was quiet for a moment, and she could feel him considering it with the thoroughness he brought to things that mattered. "A woman who was making a real decision," he said finally. "Not a vacation decision or an experiment decision, a real one, the kind that costs something." He paused. "And a woman who was going to make that decision work through sheer will whether anyone helped her or not." Another pause. "I thought if someone helped her what she built would be extraordinary." He looked at her. "I was not wrong." She squeezed his hand. Thomas had fallen asleep against Matthew's shoulder with the sudden completeness of very young children, his small fist still loosely closed around a fold of Matthew's collar. "And the rafter sea men," she said. When they said I would not last. When they said I was too city-bred for the frontier, and you said give her 1 season. I said it because I believed it, he said simply. I had watched you for 3 weeks, I knew what you were. You had known me for 3 weeks, she said. Some things are not about time, he said. They are about attention. She thought about that for a long moment. I want to tell you something, she said. He looked at her, waiting. That first week, before you. When I stood in front of this house alone and felt the full size of what I had done. She stopped, gathering the words for something she had never said aloud. I was afraid, not in the way that makes you run. In the way that makes everything very clear. And I made myself a promise that week that I would not leave here because it was hard, and I would not let anyone's doubt become my doubt, and I would build something real here regardless of whether anyone believed I could. He listened to all of it. And, he said. And I did, she said. But I want you to know that the year you were in it was different from the weeks before, not because you made it easier, though you did, but because you watched me do it and you saw it correctly. That is not nothing. That is not a small thing to be seen correctly by someone. He turned to her, carefully so as not to wake Thomas, and he kissed her temple, and she felt it in the way she felt everything from him, all the way through. I see you, he said. Every day. I am always going to see you. Thomas stirred slightly, settled, and went back to the thorough sleep of the entirely loved and entirely secure. The Kansas night spread out around them, enormous and particular and lit with more stars than any city she had ever known, and Jane Collins Collier stood on her land in the wild and open country that had been a destination and had become a home, and she felt the fullness of her life with a clarity that had nothing uncertain about it. She was here. She had built this. She loved and was loved with the whole honest weight of it. In the spring of 1886, Jane gave Matthew a daughter they named Clara, a small, fierce girl with dark hair like her father and blue eyes that looked at the world with a frank assessment that her parents found immediately familiar. Thomas, who was 2 and in possession of strong opinions, examined his sister with the seriousness of a small person taking on a significant responsibility, and then apparently decided she was acceptable, because he patted her head with the exaggerated gentleness of a child who has been told to be gentle, which made both his parents laugh at the same moment. Elsa Brennan came with apple preserves and tears of happiness, and a comprehensive list of everything they would need for the first year with 2 children, which Jane received gratefully, and filed alongside all the other knowledge she had accumulated over 4 years on the Kansas plains. Margaret Hale had established herself on her land east of town by the time Clara was born. She had had her difficulties, including a bad first winter and a fence dispute with a neighboring homesteader that had required Marshal Davis's intervention, but she had come through them with the stubbornness that Jane had recognized in her at the stagecoach, and by 1886 she was reasonably settled and had begun teaching the younger children's section at the Caldwell school alongside Jane, which had become necessary as the community grew. The frontier was changing. The open range was closing, the cattle drives slowing as the railroads extended further south, the towns growing more settled, more complex, more layered with the ordinary life of a community rather than the temporary infrastructure of a trail stop. Caldwell was becoming something different from what it had been in 1882, not better or worse in any simple accounting, just different, the way everything changes when enough people make enough real decisions about where they intend to stay. Jane watched this change with the attention she gave to most things, careful and interested, neither nostalgic for what was ending nor anxious about what was coming. She had learned on this land in this life that change was not the thing to resist or to chase. It was the thing to be present for, to see clearly, to work with. She taught her students that, without using those words. She taught it by example, by being someone who had arrived with no frontier knowledge and had learned, systematically and stubbornly, and with help from people who saw her clearly, until she knew this land and this life in her body and her daily practice. Her students, who were the children of people who had done the same thing or whose parents had done it before them, recognized the lesson even when they could not articulate it. On a Sunday afternoon in the fall of 1886, nearly 4.5 years after Jane Collins had stepped off a stagecoach in Caldwell, Kansas, and been assessed, and found too city-bred for the frontier, she sat on the front step of the homestead with Thomas beside her and Clara in her lap and Matthew's hand on her shoulder, and she looked out at the land. The kitchen garden was put to bed for the winter, properly mulched. The fence lines were straight and properly gated. The barn's north wall had been plumbed for 3 years. The sunflowers were dry and magnificent along the south fence. The house behind her was warm and provisioned, and full of the evidence of the life they were living in it. The books on the shelf, the children's things scattered with comfortable disorder, the jar of preserves on the kitchen table, the maps on the wall where Matthew tracked the ranch boundaries and Jane tracked her students' home locations to understand who needed what kind of attention. Thomas said, very seriously, "Mama, how long did it take before Kansas was your home?" She looked at this boy who was growing into himself with an earnestness that delighted her, and she thought about the answer. "About 1 season," she said. Matthew's hand on her shoulder tightened slightly. She reached up and covered it with her own. Clara made a decisive noise that expressed satisfaction with the current arrangement of things, which they all agreed was the correct response. The sky above the Kansas plains was that particular blue, the blue she had named Kansas blue in her first spring, and that had not lost any of its effect in the years since. And the light was the fall light, golden and lateral, making everything look like something worth looking at. And Jane Collins Collier sat on her front step with her family around her and her land in front of her, and 4 years of real life, accumulated in her like something solid and valuable and entirely and permanently hers. And she was home.